That last one was kind of long, but this one's not going to be as bad. But the one right before was kind of the meat and potatoes. But let's go ahead and talk about different types of muscle fibers, because there actually are different types of skeletal muscle fibers. We're going to talk about different types, like the fast and the slow muscle fibers, and kind of what they're good for, what they're used for. So we have three main types. We have slow oxidative, we have fast oxidative, and we have fast glycolytic. So let's go down the list and talk about each one. So slow oxidative, or SO for short, these are fibers that contract pretty slow. And they mainly are going to use aerobic respiration or cellular respiration to produce ATP, meaning they're really using like a lot of mitochondria to do this. Aerobic respiration, the reason why, since we're contracting a bit slower compared to the other fibers, aerobic respiration is a slow but steady process for ATP. We are more cost effective. We're going to get more bang for our buck with it, so more ATP for each individual glucose molecule we're breaking down. But it is a longer process, so you have to really kind of put the effort in to get the payoff, right? So slow oxidative, slower contractions with these fibers, relatively speaking, and using a slower but more sustainable process of making ATP. The fast oxidative, we do have fast contractions. We are still using aerobic respiration, but we fatigue more quickly than the slow oxidative ones. And then lastly, the fast glycolytic, fast contractions, but we're using anaerobic glycolysis. So we're using something like fermentation to produce ATP. This is going to be the one that fatigues the fastest, because the anaerobic process, at least in humans, right, we are not getting as many ATP for the energy we're putting in, or for the glucose and whatnot that we're putting in. It's a much faster process. The anaerobic glycolysis process is much faster, but you don't get quite as much for the glucose you put in. So you can think of like the slow oxidatives like the Prius, right? It's your 0 to 60 is not going to be great, right? You're not going to go street racing in your Prius, but when gas mileage is an issue, right, it's fantastic. You can go and go and go for miles before you need to stop at a pump. Versus fast glycolytic, this is like the sports car. Your 0 to 60 is fantastic, explosive, fast contractions, or you're getting from one place to another very quickly, but at the expense of a poorer gas mileage. Right, you're going to fatigue more quickly. You're going to have to get back to that fuel station sooner than you would the Prius. That's kind of the best way to explain it, using like something like a car. And so what are these different fibers kind of good for? So usually when we look at the slow oxidative, really the ones that use the aerobic respiration, typically we're looking at fibers that are better at slow but more sustained workouts, right? And everyone has a mix of these. No one has only one or the other, right? But people have different ratios, right? The fibers that are like slow oxidative are going to be better for things that require a long sustained response. So let's say running a marathon. You won't find me doing that ever, but let's say you wanted to. Your slow oxidative muscle fibers would be more reliable in this case, because they are contracting a little slower, but they're using a process that produces a lot of ATP. They're not going to fatigue as fast. Versus if you're running like a 100-meter dash, right, a very short race, you're looking at, somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds, depending if you're extremely fast or not so much, right? That's a very short race in comparison. You're looking at, with the marathon, you're looking at hours of running, versus the 100-meter dash, you're looking at 15 to maybe 20 seconds, depending on how fast you are. Right? Definitely no more than probably 30 seconds for most people. So extremely fast. And so you need that ATP very, very quickly. And if you notice, like when you run like a sprint, you can't sustain it for very long. You fatigue, you can't maintain it, you have to stop, right? And that stopping is that from that fatigue. The muscles just cannot carry you any faster. They cannot sustain it any longer than they are. All right, so now let's get into development and regeneration of muscle cells. So we're going to talk about the function of satellite cells. We're going to talk about fibrosis. We're going to talk about which muscles have the greatest regeneration ability. So when we look at what muscles develop from, they're developing from what's called mesodermal somites. And so this is one of the reasons why you might see like somatosensory. So if you think about what somatosensory is we're talking about like the sensory organs we find in like the skin and muscles. That's somite, right? Som, that prefix is there. But mostly skeletal muscles are coming from the mesoderm, from these somites, with the coming from that general mesoderm. These somites are going to give rise to myoblasts. Myo, we talked about earlier, we want to think with muscles. Blast, we talked about this one with the skeletal system. Remember the osteoblast, which helped build up bone. So the myoblast, in this case, is going to build up muscle. It's a muscle-forming stem cell. The myoblasts are going to fuse to form a myotube, and this is where we get the multiple nuclei in the skeletal muscle cells, because a bunch of these stem cells, each one that has their own nucleus, are fusing together. And so they're all bringing their own nucleus to the table. We end up with multiple nuclei inside the cell, right? So that's one of the reasons, or that's the reason why we see that. So these satellite cells are going to help repair skeletal muscle cells, right? They're like the little pit crew, right? So think of them like the pit crew in like a race that come in and like they switch the tires out, right? They do all the things that are needed to make sure the muscle cells are running at their peak. So they're going to help make sure that protein synthesis happens for any repair and growth. Their regeneration of these fibers is there is a limited extent, but they will basically help repair damage to the cells that are already living. Right? So this is one of the things, like when you go and exercise, right, sometimes you can cause like little tears and whatnot. The satellite cells help build that back up to help it repair and grow. So if you get an injury or if you work out really hard or something, right, the satellite cells can help regenerate that muscle. Sometimes though, if there's too much damage, right, that the satellite cells can't handle it. And again, this is not necessarily from like exercise. We're talking something extreme, right? The cells are too damaged because something crazy has happened. And then we have what's called fibrosis occur. Because the muscle fibers are damaged, they're getting replaced with scar tissue instead. Right, so they're getting replaced with like connective tissues, and so that's going to lead to less elasticity, less ability to extend and contract when that occurs.